And this is the video for Python 2, Comp 246. We're on Chapter 9, starting on slide 36. Hey, we're on object-oriented programming, and we're on to creating a class that models a two-dimensional grid, often called a two-dimensional array in some languages. So Python doesn't have a built-in two-dimensional array, at least not directly, but we're going to create one here with a class. So here we are, we're going to write a class for a two-dimensional grid. And the idea is, it's like a table, like an Excel worksheet with rows and columns. So our new class is going to be called grid. Let's see how this works. So the constructor for this class is going to create a grid, and at that time you can specify the width and height, or you can think of it as the number of columns and rows, however you want to think about it. And also you can specify a value to be put into all of those cells in the two-dimensional grid. Or if you leave that out, it'll fill all the values in with an initial value of none. Okay, now, how do you access elements of this two-dimensional grid? Well, just like you might think. The grid, and then you'd have the first coordinate, like the row number, and then the column number. And this could be on the left-hand side of an assignment operator. That's how you would put a value into this cell of the grid. Or it can be in the right-hand side, in which you're extracting a value from that cell. We'll see how this works. So here's the interface to the grid class. Here's the constructor. Create a new grid, number of rows, number of columns, and optionally a fill value. It defaults to none. By the way, this is going to be a keyword parameter, an optional keyword parameter, or argument, depends how you think about it. Hey, we're going to have some methods in this, like, oh, get the height, if later on you want to see how, let's see, that would be how many rows are in the grid. Of course, you specified that back at constructor time, but if later on in your program you wanted to find out how high it was, you can. How wide it was, you can. And there's a dunder string dunder method that renders the grid in some human readable form. What else do we have? We're going to have a dunder get item dunder, and this is going to be the way to implement accessing the grid by row and column as in these two dimensions, row and column. And finally, there's a find method. And what does the find method do? Well, it searches all of the rows and columns, all the cells actually, to find this value, if it's there. If it is there, if it's found, it's going to return the row and the column in which it was found. By the way, it's going to return a tuple, which is like a list, but immutable, with the row and column in it. Or, if that value wasn't found, it'll return the value none. So, let's see about how you might implement that class. Okay. So, the design process is you'd think about what data structures will the class use to represent a two-dimensional grid. And here's what the choice that is made by the author of our book. There's going to be an instance variable called data, and what it's going to be is a list, holds the top level list of rows. It's going to be a list of rows. And each one of those is going to be a list of the columns. So it's a nested list, a list in which each item is itself a list. Python can do this. Python can, nest these data structures arbitrarily deep. Although 2 levels deep is kind of common, deeper is less common. Let's see, so each item within this list will be a list of the columns in that row. Okay, so we're going to have a couple of methods. We know about that. We just talked about them. Dunder init, dunder, and dunder string dunder to give you a human readable view of the grid. Okay, we're going to have a subscript operator that would actually two subscripts, that is two square brackets, one for the rows and one for the columns. And we're going to have a find method. Okay, let's see. Let's see if we have code for that. Maybe not. I thought we were going to have code. Nope. Well, that's a bummer. Maybe in your book you have code. Let me see if in the Word document we have the code for that. So here we are in the Word document. Oh yeah, here is the code. So this is actually code that uses it. That is, it's not the code that implements it, but the code that uses it. And down here is the implementation. So let's look at some test code that actually uses this. So we're in some file that's going to be using the grid. So we're going to import from grid.py the class grid with an uppercase G. So that's what we're going to do in this file. And now we're going to try it out. So we're going to create a new grid with 3 rows, 4 columns, and a fill value of 0. And you're going to assign that new object that got created here to a variable called grid. Kind of confusing with so many things called grid, but they're different things. Because this is a class with the uppercase G, and this is a variable of type uppercase grid. And all these parameters are actually keyword parameters, rows, columns, and fill value. Now, if you if you want to print that grid out, here's what it's going to look like. It's going to be 3 rows, 4 columns each, with the initial value 0. By the way, the code in the class that makes this view like this is the dunder str dunder. Double check that. I guess it's in the PowerPoint slides. Okay, so we've got that. Now, let's say we want to set a cell in that two-dimensional grid. Here's how to do it. Pretty straightforward. That's the name of that variable, grid. Row 1, column 2, we're going to set that cell to 5. Now remember, the origin, it's called the index origin of all of these is going to be 0. Just like you know, the first element of a list is the 0th element of the list. And so it is with a grid. So when we say row 1 here, well, remember 0 is the first row, 1 is the second row. Here's the first row, here's the second row. And we want to set in column 2, well, this is column 0, 1, and 2. So that's the cell that we're setting to 5. How about trying to do a find? We want to find the value 5 in the grid. And it's found, and so we're going to print out the tuple, parentheses means tuple, row 1, column 2. If we try and find the value 6 in the grid, it's not there because we didn't insert a 6. And so the return value from this find is going to be none. Let's see what else we can do. So here's a doubly nested list in which we're going to loop through all of the rows. Here's an example of why we might want to be able to call get height, get the number of rows. For each row, we're going to loop through the number of columns using get width. And now we're going to set an element at that row, at that column, to this value right here. And so what is this value right here? Well, it's in parentheses. So what type is created by Python when you have something in parentheses? And the answer is a tuple. So each element in this grid is going to be a tuple with a row number and a column number. Therefore, when you print it out, you get a two-dimensional array of tuples. Open paren, 0, 0, close. This is the tuple that's stored at row 0, column 0, etc., all the way out to row 2, column 3. So, in-class question to you. So, hey, what in the above example, what is the type, the data type of each element in a grid in this particular example? Because, by the way, this grid is totally generic. You can have items in the grid of any type. They could be integer, float, strings, anything. Lists, dictionaries. It's pretty fancy how Python works. But in this particular example up here, what's the type of each element? Pause the video and think about it. And the right answer is tuple. Each element in the grid is of type tuple. How do we know that? Because I mentioned it a minute ago. We're setting it, we're assigning this value to that element of the grid, and this value is a tuple. How do we know that? Because it's surrounded by parentheses. Okay. Okay, I went over this a little bit ago. Okay. And I don't know if this is worth time going through, but here's the code, and it's in the book. I think you can learn something if you walk through this code and make sure you understand it. And if you have any questions on it, to ask me about it. So there's the code for the class grid. Okay. Okay. Let's see how we're doing on time. 11 minutes. I think we're going to wind down really shortly. So you and I just walk through all this grid material. And we'll resume on this in the next video. Catch you there.